Well, hi everyone. Welcome to Kembali 2020, a Rebuild Bali Festival, a digital program designed to inspire, excite, reconnect, and revitalize the Balinese and Indonesian community from October 29 to November 8, 2020. Kembali, the Indonesian word for return or come back, represents revitalization in the face of global challenges. The festival will unite people in Bali and Indonesia together with an international audience at a time when travel is largely impossible and creating connections is more important than ever before. Well, it is just my great pleasure to welcome you to this session with Doug Bach Clark. And the title of the session is also the title of his book, The Last Whalers, 3 Years in the Far Pacific with a Courageous Tribe and a Vanishing Way of Life. So, Doug, it is just great to meet you. I've looked up your biography, which I'll quickly go, it's way too long for a guy that's so young, you've done some amazing things. He is the Gentleman's Quarterly correspondent, GQ correspondent, and a contributor for the website of The New Yorker. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, GQ, Wired, Elle, Rolling Stone, Men's Journal, Esquire, The New Republic, The Atavist, Mother Jones, Foreign Policy, The Huffington Post, and BuzzFeed, also the New York Times Book Review, and the website of The New Yorker. His many journalism honors include the Reporting Award from the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute, 2 Fulbright Fellowships, and 2 grants from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. So he's amazingly accomplished. I'm curious, 2 Fulbrights. What were your 2 Fulbrights?
Well, first of all, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thanks as well to everyone who's watching and to the festival itself and Janet for arranging everything. It's a real honor to be here, and I wish we could all be together in person. But I'm glad to still be able to do this and bridge the gaps even virtually. Yeah, so my first sort of extended period in Indonesia was through a series of 2 Fulbright fellowships. They were both cultural ones. I was teaching English first in Sumbawa in NTB, and then the second one I spent in Aceh, and I was sort of helping set up the program there. So I spent both of those years were shortly after I had graduated from college. And it was one of the best periods of my life. It was just wonderful to be able to immerse in Indonesia and get to spend time all across the archipelago.
I didn't know you'd been in Aceh because I've done some research and writing on Aceh too. What years were these? When were these Fulbrights?
2010 through 2012.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, that's every time is an exciting time to be in Indonesia. And so you say in your book that I think it's either in the foreword or the afterword that I guess when you were in Sumbawa that you decided to go to Pulau Lembata just sort of out of curiosity, or how did you happen to end up there?
Well, I heard stories while I was in Sumbawa of the Lamalerans, who are a group of peoples who still hunt whales the old way with their original adat, and they do so by rowing out wooden boats into the ocean and then using bamboo harpoons to go after sperm whales. And when I first heard this in Sumbawa, I did not believe it. I thought someone was pulling my leg. The people at my school had a lot of fun jokingly telling me a lot of things, and sometimes I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't at the beginning. But eventually I realized that this was true, and then I had a few weeks off at the end of my first Fulbright fellowship where I was still in the country, and so I just road tripped across NTB and NTT and ended up in Lambada and spent a few weeks in La Malera. And at that point, I had no plans to write about them. I hadn't done journalism or any sort of nonfiction writing in school. And I was just really excited to see everything Indonesia had to offer. In Sumbawa, I stayed in, sorry?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, in Sumbawa, I stayed in Sumbawa Besar, but there's sort of a series of mountains across the center of the island which are very unpopulated and which have some beautiful, intact, original jungle. And so many weekends I would sort of go up into those mountains and just hike and go from kampung to kampung. And while I would be there, I got to see just some incredibly striking village traditions and adat that I also saw was being affected by sort of more modern global culture coming in. And this was just happening on Sumbawa on a very scale. And that, I think, really was the first time I sort of encountered and began thinking about how local customs and local traditions interact with globalization. And so by the time I got to La Malera, it was something that I was thinking about a lot.
Right, right. And I imagine the same thing in Aceh too, that's, I hadn't realized that you had had these other two experiences prior, which sound pretty intense. I'm also so interested, I understand you graduated from Duke with a degree in English, and you were not intending to be a journalist.
No, I didn't have a whole lot of direction in life. I really loved writing. I really loved words and books when I graduated. But I was more interested in exploring and seeing places that were different and meeting people who were different than me and going into cultures that were different than my own, which is how I ended up in Indonesia. I'd spent the year between graduating college and going to Indonesia doing a series of basically odd jobs. And yeah, I hadn't really thought about writing nonfiction until sometime after I got to La Malera, and I had started to realize, thinking about those challenges to Adat and some of the things that I was seeing while I was in Indonesia, I realized that a lot of those stories were just incredibly powerful and weren't being told.
Right.
And that, imperfectly as I could tell them, even though I wouldn't be able to do so perfectly, I thought there might be some worth in doing so. And that's really, I think, how I got interested in becoming a journalist.
That's fascinating. I don't know if you know, but at George Washington University, where I'm a professor, I'm in a journalism program, and the one skills class I teach is narrative writing. And I'm definitely going to have all of my students watch this because, you're not that much older than they are. And the things that you have done are really just astonishing. And, I'm always telling them that you're a journalist, you have to be interested in everything. You have to be interested in the world. And it sounds like, listening to you talk, you almost sound like a throwback to a much earlier era of the sort of explorer journalist who's really out there, just sort of figuring out what's interesting to write about.
Well, thank you. I definitely would say that especially at the beginning, I was sort of figuring it out as I went along. There was a book that I think was very seminal for me. It was called Behind the Beautiful Forevers by Catherine Boo. And reading, I don't even remember how I ended up getting that, but reading that made me see the ways that you could tell stories like what was going on in Indonesia or eventually La Malera, or in the case of that book, in India, and hopefully have a global impact. And so that from there it was took a lot of time to sort of develop the skills and abilities to do that effectively. It was probably 5 years, I think, between sort of getting interested in and really being able to do a larger project like La Malera. But it was something that you could sort of learn bit by bit and piece by piece as I went
I read
along.
a very interesting interview that you did with The Atlantic, and you said something that it answered a question I had, because at first I thought it's such a wonderful story, and there's so many characters' stories, but there did seem to be sort of one main character, John. And then I thought, well, he's not really the main. Can you explain how sort of your process about how you like who John is and why first you thought he'd be a good main character, and then why you decided that the story was bigger than that? You want to just tell us about John first, because he's a really interesting guy.
So John, Johannes Demon Heriona, also known as John, is a young man who lives in La Malera. And when I went back to write the book, one of the first things, at this point the dates are a bit blurry, but within a few weeks of me arriving, he was involved in a whaling accident. and his leg was very badly hurt. And before that, he'd been a very sort of promising apprentice harpooner and an apprentice whaler. And this injury made it unclear whether or not he would be able to continue hunting. And this is a really important thing in La Malera, because most of the calories they get are from hunting marine mammals, whether it's whales or other types of fish. And so from the outset, I think it was that dramatic event that sort of pulled my attention to him out of, there's about 1,500 people in La Malera. But we also just hit it off incredibly quick. I introduced myself to his family. I asked their permission to sort of come in and just sort of talk to him. But we just ended up spending hours and hours. I mean, literally countless hundreds, if not thousands of hours together over the next 3 years as he eventually recovered and sort of continued his quest to become a Lama-Fa.
Can I just ask quickly, did you witness that accident on the boat, or did he just tell you about it? Did you see that happen?
I was elsewhere, but I was there in La Malera. So I did not physically see him go under. But one of the amazing things about being able to write in La Malera and having spent so much time there was in these almost all the other hunts I described, I was there. I have dozens of photographs, many of which are there in the book of those hunt scenes. But for the moments that I wouldn't be there, or where, the hunts are sprawling, chaotic events, which take place over anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. And there can be anywhere from, several boats to 14 or 15 spread out, literally spread out across miles of ocean. And so if I did not get to see something myself, I would be able to talk to the whole crew of the boat. You would have a dozen people there who all saw the same thing. And the La Malerans have an extraordinary mimetic recall of hunts. Like the same way that maybe a basketball player or a football player will be able to sort of remember each move in a game, or a chess player will remember each move. The La Malerans do this for their living, and they're extremely good, and they love to re-talk through the hunts together. This is what they sort of do when they get a jerry can of tuak, which is the palm wine, after the hunt. They just, the same way as guys in America or Australia or wherever, or in Indonesia, would talk through a soccer game or something afterwards. That's what they do. So I was very lucky to be able to just sort of sit down with them, sort of talk it through. And they loved just going back through the hunts and sort of laying it out in each sort of small detail.
Right. Yeah, you have. It's funny. I'm definitely going to use your book at some point in one of my classes, because your ability to recreate these scenes that you did not witness is really amazing. And at first, I have to admit, I was a little skeptical. And then I read both your note at the back where you explained, and that interview where you talk about the sort of what you just described, this kind of oral tradition where everybody sits around and recreates what happened. So even though there weren't recordings of it, in a way there were. At one point you compared it to like watching a Wikipedia page being built, that everybody contributed and sort of edited each other. So you've got a very clear sense of what had happened.
Yeah, and I think that was an exceptional thing for me to get to be able to do in La Malera. It was very lucky that it's an oral culture, and also that people were very excited to participate in the project and to recreate a lot of these events with me. It's something that they like to do. But I also think on a sort of a wider journalism level, it's something that I try to do for any of my investigations, anything that I write. I will usually interview someone at least 3 times about an event that I'm going to try and recreate. Right. And as you point out, I wasn't there to see John, like that specific one in John, where the boat flipped over. But for most of the others, I forget how many hunts are in the book, but we probably do a dozen. Yeah. One of the reasons I sort of included the photographs is that you can, I would be there and I'd be shooting in burst mode with a camera. And so you'd have literally, hundreds of photos throughout the course of a hunt. And you could also very exactly, other times, like when John gets his whale and finally becomes a Lamafa, I was, 30 feet away, and can describe that down to, the 10th of a second, from the hundreds of photos that I would have of that kind of hunt. So I think it's important to sort of just be gathering as much material in order to be able to later recreate those scenes.
Right. And you sounded like you gathered a phenomenal amount of material. You say how many pages and how many hours of recordings. So why did he first strike you as a kind of ideal character, main character, and then why did you decide that the story had to be bigger?
So John struck me as someone who was trying to find their place in the tribe. And while I think a lot of people have focused on this book for the dramatic events of the hunts, which are spectacular events, really what this book is about people choosing how to live in the modern world. How much of your traditions do you want to keep? How much of the modern world do you want to bring in? And how do you sort of balance between the past and the future? And so while I originally met John because of that dramatic event, it soon became very clear to me that he was living through those decisions. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, he loves the Lamalaran traditions. He truly believes in them. He wants them to continue. And on the other hand, he also knows that it's a dangerous, difficult, physically demanding life to live. And everyone in Lamalara has seen TV, has gone over the mountains to Lewa-Leba, which is a modern Indonesian town, and knows that there are other options. And so he was very curious about, becoming a security guard through family connections in Jakarta. Or another character that I profiled was very interested in becoming a DJ in Bali. And so I think that a lot of, those are the challenges and the questions facing many of Indonesia's youth today. And I thought that and not just Indonesia's youth, but many youth across the world. And that was really the story that I wanted to capture. The choice here is dramatic, become a whale hunter or become a DJ in Bali. But I think that the fundamentals of that choice hold a lot of truths that we can all resonate with.
Absolutely. So and yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go on, please.
I was just going to say, in Bali, I mean, maybe the choice is less dramatic, but if you are the child of a rice farmer, do you want to be a rice farmer or do you want to be in the tourism industry? And that's a constant choice in Bali, everywhere in Indonesia. So, yeah. So yes, I that's one of the things I love about the book, actually. So John seems to illustrate all this really well. And then why did you decide that the story had to be about more than this, or more than him?
So the book is ultimately structured around sort of three different families, and follows them as across 3 years as their sort of lives interweave and as the Lamalaran tribe sort of faces the challenges of globalization. And I thought it was important to try and have people from every perspective in the Lamalaran society. John's family had John and had his sister, and so sort of captured a lot of what it was like to be a youth. But I also wanted the perspective of the elders, of those who really, really wanted the Lamalaran traditions to continue. And so there's, one man named Franz, who is the Kapala Suku, who is both invested in keeping his clan together and all the traditions that means, but also in keeping a lot of the adat going. And there was another older man named Ignatius Pikololong, who was a champion Lamafa, a champion harpooner, who is trying to pass that on to his son. And so I think by telling the story on a wider scope, I was hoping to bring in more about the full tribe's experience and not just have it be about one individual.
Right. Yeah, I like that very much, and how they all, because each family in each generation, there are choices. that the characters make. And it all comes back to the same dilemma. I also like very much, one of my favorite sections of the book is the horrifying section at the very beginning, where you recreate something that happened. What year did it happen? 1994, which in a way sort of sets the stage here. Without, I don't think it's giving away any big secrets. Like what happened in 1994, and how does that really set the stage for everything else that then unfolds in your story?
So what happened in 1994 was that there was a whale hunt that went wrong. The men were working in the village and repairing a road up on a set of cliffs. And from those cliffs, they could see out into the Deepwater Strait where the whales like to migrate. And they saw the whales. And so they ran down and got on their boats without being fully prepared. They wanted to go and catch the whales. And they were able to catch the whales. They were able to embed three of the boats were able to embed harpoons into one very large whale. But that whale was not incapacitated by those harpoons. Normally it takes dozens of strikes in order to take down a whale. And there is from the head of each harpoon, there is a rope that attaches to the Tena, which is their special whaling boat. And so the whale dragged them all night deeper into the ocean, and they, being the very brave men that they are, weren't particularly worried, and they rode along for however many miles it was that the whale was dragging them. And then come morning, they again tried to fight the whale, only to have the whale really damage the fleet. And after a while, they realized they had to give up. They were not going to be able to take this whale, and they had to cut their lines. But in doing so, they suddenly found themselves dozens, if not, scores of miles deep into the Savu Sea with broken ships and not exactly sure where they were, or no provisions, and being unsure how they'd get back. And so what ensued was several days of them trying to sail and row while also having no food and water to get home. And they lost one of the boats. They almost ended up perishing, but at the last minute, a tourist vessel cutting between Flores and Timor happened upon them, essentially by chance. So it had received a radio transmission and picked them up on radar and rescued them. And so many of these men who, to that point, many of them had not been off the island, many of them were aware of, but had not seen up close many of the things that were happening in Kupang and other parts of Indonesia that were modernizing, were suddenly taken on a tourist cruise vessel into a modern city. And so that was a really momentous event for them. It showed them, those individual people, sort of the wider world, especially one character who I write about throughout the whole book. And it was just an event that has remained marked on Lamalaran memory ever since.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and you do a beautiful job of using it to set the stage, because they see Kupang, they see the big city, they also see the ships, they see the tourists. I love the scene where somebody gives them some bread and they think this is the worst cake they've ever had. But wasn't there also something where the men who would become two of your big characters, heads of different families, they decide to separate the boats, and so one boat actually goes back, and so in a way they split up the fleet in a way that they weren't supposed to do, or they don't usually, or the way of the ancestors would not usually smile on that, right? Wasn't that part of it too?
That was part of it. And it's a combination of both circumstance and some of the boats breaking and the wind and everything else, but also a decision by one that they were going to go ahead and try and get help. And maybe that was the best choice for everyone, but it certainly helped that boat more than it helped the sinking boat that they left behind. And it ended up working out for everyone. But
yeah, I mean, I was going to raise this later, but I was really struck by how you talk about the Lamalarans have a kind of like a basic philosophy, and you have to say it in their language, but in English, it's one family, one heart, one action, one goal. And to kind of split up like this, even if it turned out to be the best thing and may have actually saved them, that's still really gut wrenching to do, to right? Or
I mean, it is a gut wrenching thing for them to do, but talking to them 2 decades later about it, and the two men you're referencing have an even closer connection than being tribes people. One of the men is married to the sister of the other man.
right.
They also had decided to move on, and they were, the close family again. And I think that is really sort of the key to La Malarian life. This is true for many hunter-gatherer societies, but I think especially for the La Malarians, is that when you hunt communally, when you do everything communally, you have to have very strong social bonds, and
Right.
that social fabric and the sort of the mutual honoring of each other is extremely important. And they, I think that there were some feelings hurt by that event, but in the end, they also realized that it was more important to reforge the tribe and reforge those bonds and go out, and they still hunt together.
Right. I know, because you allude to it again later on in the book. You say that you allude to the incident, and that hadn't occurred to me. I actually read through the book twice, and it was the second time I realized, oh, these are brothers-in-law. The So that's a fascinating incident. Then the thing that sounded to me as just a reader as the second really kind of huge decision that got made was when the community in 2001 decided that they could allow for this towing method of using outboard motors, which I love how they call them Johnsons, I guess after the name of the outboard motor. So the decision to accept the Johnsons, you want to explain that and why that's so significant and really colors everything?
Yeah. So every year the La Malarans get together on the beach. There's sort of a beach in front of their village, and all of the men of whaling age who participate in the hunt sit down together and basically make the rules for that year. And until, give or take, 2000, that basically just meant reaffirming whatever the rules had been the previous year, all the way back to forever. And so at about that time, the La Malarians were really starting to see a lot of people use outboard motors, which they called Johnsons after the brand name of the American company that made them, which was Johnson
I
Engines.
love it. Love
And so they had to decide, well, are we going to use these motors as well, or are we going to stay with the ways of the ancestors? And so this was a very heated debate. And the interesting thing is this debate had actually been going on for decades. In 1975 or 74, my memory is a little bit shaky at that on that point at this point, but the UN Food Program had actually offered them outboard motors as a way to sort of improve their hunting and to be able to better feed everyone in the village as well as the outlying villages. And they had said no. They had said, we're not going to do this. Hunting with these things would go against the way that the ancestors did it. And the La Malarians worship their ancestors. They have a very specific form of adat in which they think and they believe that the ancestors reward them for following their directives, and they reward them by sending them whales and other fish to catch. And so if you break those rules, you're not going to catch anything, and that will be your punishment, and you'll starve. And so the first time they were offered these engines, they said no. And it was fairly easy for them to say no at that point. Very few other people were using them. But as the decades went on into the 1990s, many of the other communities on Solor especially, but also on Lambata, started to get access to these engines and to use them to fish. And the La Malarians could see this happening. They'd be out there rowing and using their palm leaf sails. Like, man, that looks pretty good. Especially the younger guys thought that might not be so bad, rather than rowing all day or having to use palm leaf sails. And so various people started to make arguments, well, like, you know, all right, maybe we won't use it for hunting, like, but wouldn't it be good to have maybe one or two of these motors to help drag heavy logs down the coast for when we go to there's this sort of special jungle where they'll harvest logs and then float them down the coast, and it'll be easier. Like, we don't really want to spend 3 days rowing a log back home. Or what if someone gets hurt and we need to bring them, there's no real good roads over the mountains, we need to bring them around the island to one of the towns and where there's a hospital. That's a good reason. Or we can use it for just transport. And so at first they got one engine, then two engines, but it wasn't going to be for hunting. And then one day someone's just transporting another person down the coast and they see a manta ray, and well, they don't really have enough people to like row after the manta ray, but if this guy uses the engine and this guy has the harpoon, we're hungry. That's a good looking manta ray. There's a lot of meat there. So they go and get it. And then, then you get into the question of, well, is it okay to hunt any animal? Maybe we'll just hunt the non-whale animals. The whale's the most important. Those are the main gifts of the ancestors. Let's keep, maybe the ancestors are okay with us using the Johnson for non-whales. And then, of course, eventually you get into the question of whether or not you're going to use them for whales. And so I thought, to be honest, my editor wasn't thrilled that I was spending so much time and sort of effort tracking down this long history of the sort of evolution of this idea. But to me, this seemed very important because this is how a culture changes.
Right. No, I completely disagree with your editor and agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I wouldn't be surprised if those first drafts went on a little bit too long on those points. But, in those shifting ideas and in those sort of the shift of what's okay, I think is very much the story of how a culture changes. And so today, what the LaMalarians have agreed on is they will not use the Johnson engines on the Tana. There's a separate kind of smaller boat which they can use the Johnson engines on, and they can hunt non-whale animals. But the whaling is sacrosanct, and the Tana will not use a Johnson engine on them to attack the whale. And so that line is still very clear, and for them is how for them feels right, and feels like that's sort of what I've been talking about in terms of deciding what to keep from the past that is good, and also what to draw from the future that is good.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the great strengths of your book, is how you very carefully set this up, that they don't want to live in a heritage village. They don't want to be I was interested when you mentioned later how many tourists actually come to Pulau Lembata. For some reason, it didn't occur to me, oh yeah, there'd be backpackers that show up, but that they don't want to be a heritage village. But they also don't want to abandon the traditions, and it certainly makes sense. You can catch a lot more fish a lot faster if you've got a motorboat. And so how they work out these compromises is really interesting. But the things that they feel they can't compromise, and I think that to me is one of the great strengths of your book. We actually can watch this in real time as they're just trying to deal with these decisions. Like, I noticed toward the end, you make a lot more reference to they're getting calls that phone calls that, we saw the whales. They're so that's helpful. You're out of eyesight, but your buddies can say, hey, there's whales. And then so they are clearly adapting, but also struggling to hold on.
Well, I think, one thing that I really wanted to capture in the book, and I think one thing that the LaMalarians wanted to make sure that I was able to get across correctly when they were talking to me, was that these are active choices. These are, and I think that is really important, that this is their choice, and this is a pretty incredible thing that this community has done. It's both managed to retain its traditions and its customs, while also bringing in what it feels is good about the outside world, and there's another town that I talk about a little bit in the book that had very similar traditions to La Malera, but just on the other side of the Solor Strait. And 30 years ago, those towns were, La Malera and this other town were essentially identical. They came from sort of the similar historical route. They were doing things the same. They had very similar adat. But this other town decided very quickly to sort of abandon its adat and its culture, whereas the La Malerans, and today has none of it. It's a town actually most known for illegally poaching animals, which the La Malerans have a special exemption, which means they are not doing so. But the La Malerans have sort of kept it in control and made very conscious decisions about what they're going to do rather than sort of letting modernity overwhelm them.
Well, it looked to me like there are several ways in which modernity is coming in. And one theme that I think emerges throughout your book is the role of the Indonesian government, that you at one point note the first election after the fall of Suharto and how everybody voted. And then you note, I think there's the market where there's several different villages, both the ones who grow vegetables and your La Malerans who don't grow vegetables but have fish, how they exchange and stuff. But then the Indonesian government has imposed a tax that in order, when you come in, you have to pay 1,000 rupiah. And so is and then the Indonesian government is also sending local tourists to see Pulau Lembata as possibly to open up domestic tourists, because I guess these whalers are kind of a big tourist attraction. So tell us about how after your years there, how did you see the role of the Indonesian government? Is it pretty good, or from the perspective of the La Malerans, is this a good thing, a mixed blessing? What's good, what's bad? What do you think?
So it's a very complicated thing. I don't think that there's a sort of a simple yes, no, good, bad answer to those questions. For a long time, La Malera was essentially outside of the control of the Indonesian government, and there are still many, shall we sort of discussions about how much do their traditions have precedence over governmental law, or how much governmental law has precedence over their traditions. And that's been a very heated topic in terms of conservation and in terms of some other things. But, increasingly they're getting integrated. They have an SD and an SMP. They have, everyone, and people go all back and forth all the time. At this point, they're very participant larger Indonesian project and think of themselves as proud Indonesian citizens, but they also very much want to protect their adat and their local culture. And I think that's something that Indonesia sees in communities all across the archipelago. And I think that's one amazing thing about Indonesia, is that it has so many different unique cultures. And the Indonesian government, the Indonesian federal government's challenge is to how do you make these all one without eliminating their uniqueness? Whereas, there's always going to be a push and pull from the center.
Did the Indonesian central government build that port? Who built the port at Wulandani? Is that
Wulandoni.
Wulandoni.
Wulandoni. I believe that was the Kabupaten. I believe that came out of the local regency. I believe it was using national funds, basically designated for infrastructure projects for NTT from Jokowi as part of his campaign promises. So the one, I tried to mix in, to an extent that I could understand it, the events of Indonesian national politics, because they're very much affecting the everyday lives of these individuals. But at the same time, there's also no policemen within dozens of miles of La Malera. And so sometimes if the La Malerans want to do things their way, they'll just do them that way. And so I think that, again, that sort of tension and back and forth is very important, and is also similar to many other parts of Indonesia in some ways.
The book is so rich because you do a fine job of bringing those things in, even down to the level of I was fascinated by how there was, you know, the Lamalerans traditionally Christian, animist Christian, whatever, and then another rival village traditionally Muslim, and how that all kind of that actually is folded on top of an even more fundamental split among the people of that island from, you know, different, and you go into great detail on all this, all the way back background and the ancestors, but, you know, you just probably too, we should talk about this offline because I was fascinated by this, but perhaps it's too obscure for this discussion. But the thing that's not obscure that I wanted to ask you about is tourism. Just before our session, I looked up on TripAdvisor, Pulau Lembata, and, you know, there's like 80 pictures there, and there's some homestays. And you mentioned when you wrote the book that back in 2015, that they got about 200 foreign backpackers a year and 2,000 Indonesian visitors a year. So what's been the impact of tourism on the Lamalerans? What is, like, how do you get there? Let's say, you know, somebody in the audience says, I want to go and see. How do you even get there?
So that's also, again, a complex question. On the whole, I would say that tourism has actually not had a huge effect on Lamalera. It's a very dramatic thing to see pictures of Bule or you know, people from Jakarta who just sort of show up. But it's a very small town and very few people stay. So those numbers that you were citing come from the tourism department in Lewoleba. You know, they track, and it might actually even be higher because I don't know how accurately they track everyone. But what happens is that most of those people come sort of on these like dive boats that do circuits from Flores and from Labuan Bajo. And so I don't know the exact routes of those sort of dive boats, but they'll do a circuit on the north side of Flores, go over to Lembata, swing back around. And so they'll be there in town for maybe 2 or 3 hours.
So
You know,
sort of day trippers on a cruise, kind of.
Yeah, well, they'll sort of be coming back down the south coast of Lembata and Flores, and they'll pass by. They'll sort of anchor offshore, you know, come be brought onto shore for, you know, several hours at the most, and then you know, maybe the Lamaleran, you know, some of the Lamaleran women will try and sell them sarangs or ikat, and to be honest, it's pretty minimal. Almost none of those tourists speak Indonesian, and, you know, to be honest, the Lamalerans just sort of let them do what they're going to do, and are very happy for the sort of financial support that they provide the village, not just sort of through things they buy, but the government actually makes sure that those boats pay a semi-substantial fee for each visit.
That's interesting.
I think, to be honest, I think that the Lamalerans are more, I don't know if impacted is the right word, but find it more interesting when Jakartans or people from Java will come through in large groups. So the tourism departments will run, I don't know, buses that can bring in, or tours that can bring in several dozen Indonesians from other parts of Indonesia who are usually living a very different kind of life.
Right.
And of course, there can be significantly more interaction there. And so I think that you know, just interesting discussions can go on. Sometimes I know Lamalerans who like met people on these tours and then ended up going and working for them in like Riau and other places, you know, as like a maid and stuff like that. So those can be more, I think, impactful. And then there's also a third category of tourists, which you noted, which is there are some international backpackers who come through, and some of them will stay for a few days. But again, it's a very small town. It's maybe 2 square miles.
It's on TripAdvisor, so there's so it does exist now. The other sort of force that I noticed in the book that you do spend some time writing about is the World Wildlife Fund. And I'm interested that you said so many people read your book because of the drama of the whale hunt. I have to admit, I would kind of just pass my eyes over a lot of that because you won't pull any punches in how totally gory this is and, horrible. Like you can tell you've really killed the whale when they're spouting blood through the blowhole. I mean, there's a lot of really gory, horrible stuff, which I guess the World Wildlife Fund has taken notice of and says how nice it would be if this were a marine park and we had ecotourism and the Lamalerans stopped killing whales. So so do you want to explain that sort of there's a really interesting back and forth between the Lamalerans and the World Wildlife Fund, which is not just foreigners, but also Indonesian World Wildlife Fund and sort of the big plan. How's that going, and what's the situation now?
So that was a very complicated situation. It happened about a decade ago, and I would say that it's not necessarily representative of the World Wildlife Fund's current beliefs or stances towards Lamalera. But at that time, the Indonesian government was looking to set up a Taman Nasional for basically the whole Sabu Sea and much of the Coral Triangle in that area. And so the World Wildlife Fund went to Lamalera as well as several other villages in the area to try and get their support. And there were either misunderstandings or some people in the World Wildlife Fund were not forthright about why they were trying to get the Lamalerans to support their national park. And the Lamalerans eventually came to believe, with some evidence, which I sort of lay out in the book in terms of emails and other things, that there had at least been talk of, or at least discussions that this national park would shut down their whaling and basically have them switch over to a whale watching tourism model. And so the Lamalerans felt this was an existential threat. They felt that not only was it threatening to destroy their adat, but that they probably couldn't survive trying to sell whale watching tours to the, again, it sounds like a large number of people who come through, but the actual number of people who stay in this tours is probably around like 200 or something. So it would not have been a sustainable way for them to live. And so they reacted very strongly and escorted the World Wildlife people out of town. And since then have strongly resisted any environmentalists' intervention in their way of life. And so it's, to be frank, it's too bad. The emails and other things that I was able to get pretty strongly show that the Lamalerans were not a full description of what the World Wildlife Fund hoped to do was not given to them at the beginning. I think there are ways that both groups could work together in a mutually beneficial way, but at this moment, that sort of the scars from that first encounter have made that very difficult.
Right. Well, you write, I think it's on page 251. You write, is internal World Wildlife Fund documents that were later uncovered showed that the Lamalerans were right. Was that you? Did you uncover them? Did you when you refer to emails?
Yeah. And I approached the World Wildlife Fund, and they have essentially said yes. And I think the correct thing to do here would be, you have that page in front of you. I believe I print their. I hope that I print their response, or do so in the endnotes, I believe.
I think so. I think so.
I think it's a highly charged and precise thing, and so I would direct readers to exactly what is said in the book, what's contained in the endnotes, rather than what's sort of coming out of my memory 2 years after writing it. Of course,
and the World Wildlife Fund does good work, but I guess actually why I wanted to highlight this was just how thorough your research was. I'm thinking of my student audience, who I hope will be watching this at some point. I mean, you didn't leave any stone unturned. That you did you didn't just listen to the La Malera and say, oh yeah, well, this is what they were up to, but you actually use documentary evidence too. It's interesting. I mean, it's a, and another thing that I found quite fascinating, you deal with the goriness of the whale hunt and also the how the La Malerans understand these are really intelligent creatures that they are hunting and killing. And you, at one point, you write, they have anticipated what science is just figuring out, that the intellect of sperm whales approaches that of humans. Sperm whales have the biggest brain of any creature in history. Their gray matter even features extremely rare neurons called spindle cells, also found in humans, which govern communication, compassion, and the ability to feel suffering. And I was quite fascinated by that, that the La Malerans, how do they think about the whales they kill?
Well, so as I lay out there, they have an immense respect for the whales, and frankly an immense love in certain ways for the whales. The whales are both, as I say, sort of highly intelligent, smart, emotional creatures that they feel a great bond with. But the whales are also, in their way of looking at the world through their adat and their sort of the religion that they had before they became Christians, they view those whales as gifts from the ancestors, which in certain interpretations of the old Lera Wulan religion can mean that they're actually reincarnations of the ancestors themselves, come to sort of give their flesh back to the tribe. And so
I wondered about that, because in that quote you actually say, I didn't read it because I wasn't sure it was right. You say they as reincarnations of their ancestors, and I wasn't sure. That's interesting, because that was the only place I read that. I knew they were gifts, but I didn't know that some people think they actually are the ancestors.
Well, as with many sort of oral religions that don't have a written sort of single Bible or Torah or Quran, there are multiple interpretations within La Malera itself on whether these are what type of gifts. But many of them do think that these are literal reincarnations. And so for them, the hunt is a spiritual act. It's not only physically sort of repeating the actions of their ancestors in the way that they are meant to live, but it's reincorporating that spiritual essence into them. And it's a spiritually as well as a physically sustaining action. And I think that when you look at it through the La Malerian's eyes, everything can flip, can switch. In that, if you're a whaler and the ancestors are trying to give you this gift and you reject it by not taking the whale, that is a grave sin, which can have many consequences further down the line. And so my purpose in the book is not to definitively decide on what's right or wrong, but to present both sort of the environmentalists' point of view, but even more importantly, to give the La Malerans their space and their platform to be able to say why they do this thing. Many people have heard the environmentalist way, but very, very few people have heard the La Malerans. And I wanted to make that understandable and relatable, and to give them a voice in that.
Well, you're very, very successful. There were two other things I pulled out that struck me. First, you quote the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples as saying the world's most vulnerable people are paying the price for today's conservation. That, it's easy for us to sit in the United States and say, oh yeah, we need to do these things, but it's the La Malerans who then pay the price. But the other thing that kind of, we only have about five minutes left, but to open it up even bigger, I was really struck by a huge theme that you bring up toward the end. The idea that what the La Malerans are going through right now, these decisions that are happening in real time, do you use Johnson's? Do you, what is your relation to the modern world? That all of our ancestors went through this, that all of us are descended from hunter-gatherers, and that that what they're experiencing, we have experienced. I was very interested in that. I wondered, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so, really until, humans all evolved as hunter-gatherers. That is how all of our ancestors survived until, give or take, 11,000 years ago, when a very small number of those ancestors figured out how to grow things and became agriculturalists. And really up until like 150, 200 years ago, large swaths of the world, depending on how you count, a third, a fourth, 3 continents, 4 continents, were mostly inhabited by hunter-gatherers, by people who, like the Lamalerans, gather their resources through hunting and through harvesting. And so human physiology and society and our minds and our bodies have all evolved within these frameworks. We have sort of hunter-gatherer instincts in an industrial society. And so one thing that makes the Lamalerans very unique is that they have maintained and preserved this hunter-gatherer way of life. And they've done so consciously. They have made great efforts in order to ensure that this culture isn't lost. And anthropologists often call hunter-gatherer societies the original affluent society. They say that, they point out, and there's a huge amount of research to back this up, that in many ways hunter-gatherers are better off than we are. They work less. They have on average like a 20-hour work week. If you can get past, so infants have a higher mortality. There are certain things that, if you don't have the technology, which you will suffer more, but hunter-gatherers in the prime of their life are healthier than us. And most importantly, by a lot of measures, they're happier. They spend more time with each other. They have stronger social connections. They do everything sort of collaboratively as a society, as a group, in the way that we were sort of talking about at the beginning of this interview. And so, when the Lamalerans are defending their traditions, when they're defending their Adat, when they're defending their past, what they're defending in a lot of ways are those connections, is that original way of life, which has many benefits and in many ways can be considered better than our own industrial one. And so it's not too far of a stretch, for them to say they're defending this incredibly good thing that we've all lost. And they're trying to do that while also taking some of the good things from our modern ways of life. But I think that they're an incredibly unique and heroic group for doing that.
And your book really captures all of that beautifully. It's not often I meet a really terrific writer who I didn't know before and I should have. And this book is just a major achievement. It's won all kinds of awards. I hope everyone goes out and gets it. It's called The Last Whalers, 3 Years in the Far Pacific with a Courageous Tribe and a Vanishing Way of Life. And I know it was published, I guess last year. And so you've moved on to other stuff, which is fascinating. Everybody should have a look at Doug Clark's website, and there are a whole bunch of other articles there you can read. You've got a movie that was at Sundance, which has an Indonesian connection too, The Assassins. It's the story of Kim Jong-nam's murder at the Kuala Lumpur airport. So I know you're not sitting around resting on your laurels. You're doing all kinds of great stuff, and it has just been a super pleasure to get to talk to you about this book. And I really hope everyone who's listening to this will race out and buy it. And I'm sorry we can't then have you sign our copies for us.
Thank you so really much for those kind words, and it's an honor to be here. And it's just such a pleasure and an honor to be back in Indonesia, even virtually. And I wish I could be there with all of you.
So I think we all feel that. Well, let me just, in closing, remind our listeners and viewers that Kembali 2020 was made possible with the support of the Yayasan Mudraswari Saraswati, patron program and their donors. The patron program was created to seek assistance for the survival of both festivals and the foundation. By making a valuable contribution to the Yayasan patron program, you will be directly involved in delivering both festivals in due time. Your contribution will guarantee the future of Indonesia's most meaningful cross-cultural platform of words, ideas, culture, and the creative arts. You can follow Ubud Writers Festival on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or visit ubudwritersfestival.com for more information about the patron program. So again, thank you so much. And thank you too to the technical team that got up very early to help us do this morning.
Thanks, everyone.